I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We start today's briefing off with an in focus. There's a number of things that concern me that I think almost everyone has been watching build over the past 2 weeks or so. And I'm seeing three crises in various stages of development right now. Maybe that turns to four later this summer and fall. We'll start with the first. Domestically, we're all watching these left-wing organizers build up another anti-Trump movement for mass protests and demonstrations that could turn disruptive this summer. They've been predominantly peaceful so far. I've not seen any violence at these nationwide protests so far. Last weekend's Saturday National Day of Protest, I would say, had some limited success. They were able to mobilize somewhere between 3, maybe as many as 5 million protesters nationwide. And that's not nothing. There is another National Day of Protest from the same group that is scheduled for Saturday, the 19th of April. It's next Saturday. And this movement is trying to build a sustained mass protest movement. I doubt that this year is going to be anywhere on the order of 2020, either by size or by intensity. So I think it's going to be smaller. I don't think we're going to have 100 days of rioting this year. I do not see it. But these groups are trying to build a sustained mass protest movement that's going to put additional pressure on Democrats to be more aggressive against the Trump administration, and also put pressure on Republicans to break ties with Trump. Fracturing the MAGA coalition was defined as the strategy following the planning and strategy sessions from November of last year to January of this year. By the way, we have 13 pages of protests coming up this weekend, individual protest events. And so if you'd like access to that, if you'd like to stay on top of where these protests are happening day in and day out, they're happening during the week as well. Just weekends are obviously going to be larger. You need to be paying attention to our protest and riot tracker. You can do that by joining the Early Warning Network over at www.earlywarningnetwork.com. The second crisis that is developing, economically and financially, I would say at this point, there is a confidence crisis that is brewing for the dollar and for U.S. Treasuries. And at this point, the risk of a financial crisis is simply high. This is not just over trade and tariffs, but also over interest rates and Treasury yields. There's a tug of war, game of chicken maybe going on between the Treasury and the Fed. I'll get to that in just a second. But a lot of people are paying attention to the dollar index and this, so far, the Fed's unwillingness to cut interest rates. The U.S. Treasury has to refinance $6.5 trillion of debt in the first half of this year. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent wants to do that, obviously, at a lower rate. The Treasury needs interest rates and Treasury yields to go lower. But the Fed has been unwilling to cut rates because they want to make sure inflation continues trending down, and also because the labor market has actually been holding up, according to the official numbers. So in short, the Fed at this point has been unwilling to cut rates, even though they've been lobbied by Treasury to do that. And I've noticed that several major banks have gone from forecasting 0 rate cuts this year to now expecting 2 or 3 rate cuts. And this is a significant change, especially if the Fed does actually cut rates 3 times this year. I think that's a very important indicator of cracks forming in the economic and financial sectors. Last week, Deutsche Bank warned, beware a dollar confidence crisis. And I do think at this point, just looking at Treasury selling off, dollar selling off, the flight to gold, I do think de-dollarization is happening at some level, because we're hearing from and seeing a lot of foreign investors question whether the dollar and whether Treasuries are still safe haven assets, whether they're going to be a safe haven asset, not just now, but in 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now. Gold continues to rocket higher on these dollar and Treasury fears. Gold is up about 23% so far year to date. The dollar is down about 8% so far year to date. And some investment banks are now forecasting a mild recession starting this year. This has also changed over the past 2-ish weeks. Meanwhile, there is a looming debt ceiling breach potentially as soon as next month. And some Democrats have lamented previously that their party leadership caved on last month's continuing resolution fight, and they appear willing to take this fight on the debt ceiling over the cliff this time because they believe it's going to irreparably damage the Trump administration and hurt the GOP heading into the 2026 midterms. So between this mass protest movement that's being built, and by the way, economic and financial uncertainty is going to at some level, drive more civil unrest. So between the mass protests and potentially a financial crisis and recession, this summer could be very bumpy. And then the third looming crisis is what's happening between the United States and China right now. Roughly 2,400 years of history says that there's between a 70% and a 90% chance of a military crisis or armed conflict between the United States and China. And I think these are two very reliable indicators. Jared, Robert, and I talked for over an hour yesterday about how likely this is and what form it could take and what that looks like. We're going to continue working on that report and get it out to you early next week. But the two large indicators that I pay attention to, historic benchmarks, if you will, is Graham Allison's Thucydides trap. And he says that about 75% of the time a revisionist power challenges a status quo power, it results in war. So in this case, the revisionist power is China, the status quo power is the United States. 75% of the time, going back to like 450 BC, it results in war. And then another book I've been talking about a lot more recently, Dale Copeland's Economic Interdependence and War, tells us that a military crisis or armed conflict is the result in 90% of the cases when future trade expectations of economically interdependent great powers turn negative, which is now happening between the United States and China. You got country A, you have country B. They do trade with each other. They're economically interdependent. One is a primary buyer, one is a primary seller. They need each other. And when future trade expectations turn negative, either becomes incentivized to start a military crisis. And this is something that China has a long history of doing. When they're backed into a crisis, they can initiate military conflict, crises or conflicts. We did the math. Jared, do you remember the math? China has a major military. We crunched some numbers yesterday and crunched some history. It's like every 8.5 years or so, China has a significant military action.
Yes, and that's since the Communist Party of China took over in 49.
Since 1947 or 49, yeah. Okay, so every 8.5 years. Their last one was, what do we say, 96?
Yep, and end of the Taiwan Strait crisis number 3 was 96.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. There's also this huge challenge of China's relative ability to take Taiwan is reducing because more and more countries are rearming. More and more countries are coordinating with each other. We're talking about Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, the United States, Australia, numerous countries potentially getting involved in the defense of Taiwan. So this is not something that is going China's way. And if you're Xi Jinping, the question you have to ask yourself really is, are we running out of time to do this militarily? And by the way, we're not even talking about an amphibious invasion. We're talking about a military blockade and encirclement of Taiwan, which China has not only been exercising, they've been rehearsing. They are able to do this. Jared, if you can hop back on just for 1 second. Yesterday, one of our key conclusions, our primary key finding was even a military blockade of Taiwan is likely to result in armed conflict between major parties in the Indo-Pacific.
Yes. And the reason for that is the only way to properly run a blockade around Taiwan basically requires land seizure from the Philippines and Japan, which the moment you break territorial integrity, they have to be involved. They're both treaty allies of the United States. All three of those nations come in, along with likely the rest of the anti-China coalition, which we've talked about and shown several times. It spirals real quickly, and that means China's main vector of attack down in southern Taiwan now becomes directly threatened by the Philippines. So China pretty much has to expand immediately.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is the $1 million $1 trillion question, $5 trillion question is, if you're China, it kind of appears that time is no longer your side. Time is a liability for you as this U.S. Indo-Pacific coalition continues to build, continues to conduct military exercises, talk, coordinate, build military interoperability. I mean, we've seen Japan and NATO conduct military interoperability exercises with Japan, South Korea, and NATO. So not just the United States. So the question is could something happen this year? And I'll tell you this also, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, I mentioned this, I think, earlier this week. He's been very clear that the strategy is to use tariffs not only to economically contain China, but to, I think we've kind of probably figured out here, the overall strategy, as Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said, is build this global coalition and, as he said, quote unquote, approach China as a group. So if you're China, are you going to wait around for this, presumably it still exists, for this Western-led global order to impose tariffs on you? And I think that's another reason why we're seeing Xi Jinping he's going to Thailand and some other countries, basically trying to hammer out these trade agreements to prevent this U.S. strategy of engaging these countries to also implement tariffs on China. I think next month there's going to be a big EU-China economic consortium where they're going to try to hammer out some sort of trade agreement. So there's a lot happening at the geostrategic level. But Jared, do you have any, just on the topic of could Chinese military action happen this year? Do you have any closing thoughts here before we move on?
Yep. I sent it over to you privately, but yes, I think it's I think it is now or never. They for the next probably 20 to 50 years, they're going to be in an increasingly worse off position. If you're going to do it, it's time.
Because of a demographic crisis.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this window, and Jared, the window for an amphibious assault comes open about twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. And that just has to do with weather and water conditions in the Taiwan Strait. But a military blockade and encirclement of Taiwan could literally happen tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay. Anytime. So that is not weather dependent.
Yeah.
And just
for storms that would break a blockade, but you can pretty easily move, get out of the way of the storm, ride it, and then come right back.
Like a typhoon.
That would technically break the blockades, but it would also prevent running a broken blockade.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then just to reiterate, Jared, do you think a military blockade of Taiwan results in armed conflict with Japan and the Philippines? And
absolutely.
And by extension, the United States. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So this could happen potentially this year. All right. Thanks, Jared. These are the three major crises that I think have a very good chance of happening. And then finally, the fourth crisis is we can't discount natural and man-made disasters causing some national crisis. A month or two ago, I was talking with a retired fire chief from California, and I was asking about the California wildfires, like in Los Angeles. And he said, almost always, anytime you see multiple fires in the same geographic area, it's arson. And so wildfires are a persistent threat for much of especially the American West. I don't think we can discount the likelihood of sabotage or of asymmetric warfare against the United States. And then also hurricane season comes up every year between June and November. And a catastrophic hurricane could potentially cause some major crisis. So those are the kind of four areas of crises that becoming a lot more concerned about